Hi, it's Dr. Menchaca Banyulo. I'm here to walk you through The Republic, the first three books. This week is a lot of reading. It's also kind of strange reading. I remember when I was your age, I read The Republic for the first time. I actually read it for the first time when I was 18. And I remember thinking, none of this makes sense. And that makes sense to think that. Maybe you don't think that, and that's great. You're way ahead of where I was. But if you are thinking that, I don't want you to feel alone. And I want you to know I'm here to walk you through it. I'm going to start off by giving just some tips and then some information about Plato. And then we'll go into talking about the text. Um, so, you know, reading Plato is an experience. I urge you to use it as an experience. If you've read a play or a novel, you know that as you keep going more deeply into the content, you begin to rethink things you saw in the beginning. You also learn through characters and characterization, like you learn, oh, this character's personality is to always highlight this, or this character's personality is to always highlight that. You learn from setting, and you basically are watching a plot unfold, not an argument in the way we think of arguments, but a plot. So I encourage you to look at these philosophical texts, which are written as plays. That's what a dialogue is, a play. I encourage you to read them as literature. Read them for an argument that is the plot. And that means you're going to need to pay attention to every character. Who says what? Why do they say it? When do they say it? Why does Socrates go off to talk about something else at a time when it seems like maybe he's stalling for time? I'll try to point that out in my lecture examples of how to do that, but that's kind of my general advice on how to read it. And I think that will make it less overwhelming. The other thing is, as it's something I'm encouraging you to read, like a piece of literature, literature is not false. It's not a lie, right? But it's also not capturing truth in the same way that, oh, a set of directions are. It's reflecting on the truth and it's leading you to a kind of truth through art, through something that's not necessarily literal or technical. And so sometimes what you're going to see is that reading Plato involves a kind of imagination, like you would use for a poem or a work of art, and that you're not going to take him literally. Reading the Republic literally misses the poetry of it, and he relies on metaphors. He's relying on comparisons. This is to this as that is to that, to sort of build his point. So it's really important that when something seems to not make sense, or when something is contradictory, or maybe contradicts something earlier you read, ask yourself, why is this happening? And I'll help you ask yourself these questions every week. Now, moving on to Plato himself. Plato is a student of Socrates, and he was his most devoted student. And he basically preserves Socratic philosophy in his writings. He was there when Socrates dies, and this is one of the sort of primary shaping influences of his life. That he watched his mentor and basically his father figure, the person who meant everything to him, who had given him a way to live, die, and die unjustly for things he hadn't done. So Plato is always afraid of democracy because he thinks that democracy is a mob, that it killed Socrates out of hatred and jealousy. He's also going to think that there's a tension between philosophy and politics, that politics needs philosophy, but that it may not always realize that it needs it to be able to work. And when that happens, politics can become corrupt. Now, you remember when you were reading Socrates' Apology that one of the things he was accused of was corrupting the youth, right? And he was corrupting particularly the young noble youth. Well, Plato's an example of that. He was a noble. He was a part of a very important Athenian family, and a family that was really involved in politics as well. And so one of people who's kind of turned away from the life of the city as the Athenians understood it, to the life of philosophy and to this sort of countercultural engagement is Plato. That's another piece of information that's important to have. So Plato himself, he founded a school of philosophy. He tried to teach a tyrant how to be a king. That didn't work out. That was a disaster. That was kind of his last experiment with politics, direct politics. But his dialogues, some people say that the rest of the Western political body of literature, of philosophy, is just a footnote to Plato. And that's kind of flippant. But I'll tell you what's true about it. This is what's true about it. The light is overtaking my face. Let's see if this works better. No, that doesn't work better. Well, I don't really want to stop the video, so you might just have to look at me being kind of really lit up. So Plato is going to be using this text to counter some of the vices of Athenian society. And it's basically an extended critique of Athenian society, the way that Antigone might be read as being that, or the Apology. And in the course of this, we'll ask some of the philosophical questions that we basically have spent, the next centuries asking in some way or another. It opens the door to the kinds of things that we've been wondering about for a long time. And it takes a first stab at it. And that's the sense in which that everything else is a footnote to it. It's an expansion on it. And you'll probably notice this when you're reading, that a lot of the things that still concern us, they're still really important to us, are here in some form or another. Maybe not in the exact form that we have now, but it's there. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on the lecture, actual content. And I'm going to try to tell it more like it's a story. I'm going to draw attention to the times when I think that you guys are going to need some more focus, or when I think that you guys can learn from this moment to sort of become better readers of Plato on your own. Reading Plato is hard. Picking up on his signals is hard. And so I want you to be able to do that on your own. That's going to take time, and I'm going to help you do it, help you learn to do it. And of course, I'm still learning to do it, because this, I may seem really old to you, but I'm young for someone who has been reading this compared to people I know have been reading it, like who are in their 70s. So it's a lifelong thing. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. The word republic is translated from the Greek word politeia. And politeia means polity, right? So then you're like, oh, okay, I see why it's republic. But politeia can also mean opinion. And opinion for the Greeks doesn't mean like that I have an opinion, like I prefer flaming hot Cheetos to regular Cheetos. An opinion is something like the basis of your judgment, sort of like what are the sets of beliefs that you have that have been shaped by your experiences and your culture and that you use to interpret the world. It's basically the water that you swim in. all the time. So like you and I are fish and we swim in the water of America, and particularly this region of America. What does that mean? Well, we're being formed by it in some way. We're taking it in some way. And that's going to be the case whether or not we resist it or we critique it. Opinion, politeia, then is another way of thinking of the name of the Republic. And what this means, and you'll see this when we get to the end, is that an important part of understanding what a political community is and what justice is in that political community is knowing what they love, what they privilege, what they don't privilege, what they fear, knowing their opinions. So the dialogue starts out at the Piraeus, which is a port near Athens. And in the setting of the book is 7 years before a civil war breaks out there, where Polemarchus, one of the characters you encounter, dies. And Cephalus, his family, was really involved in it. So everybody reading this book at the time, they would have known, oh, wow, the setting is like in this place that becomes really instrumental to the sort of politics of our time. It would be like if you and I read a play that was written and the founding scene, starting scene was when Trump overtook the rest of the Republican candidates when no one expected him to. It's sort of like this moment that people in a certain age group remember as having a certain kind of political consciousness. That's what we can look at this as. So you have these people who are going to be talking about justice in this place where there's many political battles over justice and where people are risking their lives to fight for what they think is just or to escape different kinds of injustice. And so that's really significant because I think that sometimes we think Plato is just up here, right? But he's not. He's taking things that are up here and he's bringing them down to us. And the things he's bringing down to us matter for our everyday lived lives. This is one of the things that you'll see as you keep going with political theory is it seems very abstract, but it's not if you think about it in a more practical way. And I hope that's something that we see as we keep going. So the book starts out basically asking the question, what is justice? Every Platonic dialogue asks the question. So, maybe one is, what is beauty? One is, what is piety? This one is, what is justice? Okay. And Plato starts off by asking questions, which this is his method. He uses the Socratic method to bring answers out of the person he's talking to. And then the person he's talking to is supposed to give responses, and then he follows up with questions. And through this dialectic, an answer emerges through the mutual work of the two interlocutors. So he's going to do this over and over again. And the character he starts with is Cephalus. Cephalus is an old man. He's an old rich man. He lived his life making money. Now that he's old, he's relaxed and he's happy. And he's the one that Cephalus, that Socrates asked about justice first. He says, what's the best thing you've gotten from being wealthy? And Cephalus says, not having to cheat or deceive, but being able to pay what I owe. And this gets boiled down eventually to the first definition of justice, which is speaking the truth and paying one's debts. Well, what's wrong with this definition? As with most things that you encounter in the Republic, there's some truth to it. So, like, you and I should pay back our debts. We should try to tell the truth. But on the other hand, it's very limited. And we'll talk about how it's limited. He goes on a side tangent that helps us to see how it's limited, that at first seems kind of like, why is he doing this? So Cephalus says, look, justice is clearer to me now that I'm an old man. because as I age, the pleasures of the body die. I don't really care so much about sex. I'm not driven by the desire to search for sex. I'm not driven by the desire to, you know, show myself to be better than everybody else. I'm not driven by the desire, these ambitions, or by the desire for money. Other men who are old take it hard because they still have those desires, but their body can't follow through on them. But I'm relieved because those desires made me crazy and I never had peace. And now that I'm old, I can be a good person. And so, what kind of comes up here is this idea that, well, if justice has something to do with age, it seems odd for this to be the definition of justice. Because if you can only be just when you're old, that would be weird. But also, if you can only be just when you're old, then some of us never will have the opportunity to be just if we die young. And more importantly, if you only can be just when you're old because your body's desires are gone, does that mean that you're doing anything just? You're not really making a choice. You just don't want to do things that were unjust anymore, on Kepler's definition, because you don't feel like it. But is that actually being just? Or is that just like taking the easy way out? I think I'm going to have to pause this because it's shining right in my face. Okay, so you can see me now. So then you turn out to start to rethink based on this exchange, Kepler's whole definition, right? Well, if being just means paying back your debts and keeping your word, the poor might never get to do that. Specifically, like, you know, if you've read Les Miserables or you saw the musical, think about Jean Valjean, who stole money, who stole bread, right? And then is in prison for stealing bread. But he stole the bread for his niece. And if he hadn't stolen it, you know, she'd be starving. Even Aquinas says stealing bread when you're starving from someone who has more is not stealing. So there are some people who, by necessity, are not going to be able to just never take. Or maybe there are some people who, by necessity, may never pay back their debts. They may never make enough money to. Maybe they have to take out debts that are unjust. Maybe there's an unfair interest. And what you see is that just like Cephalus's age has made him a better person, according to his definition, Cephalus's money has made him a better person, according to his definition, because he can pay back his debts. And what you start to intuit is that he probably did a lot of bad things to make his money. And now, what is the debt he can pay most of all? The debt he can pay most of all is the debt to the gods, because he leaves and he goes to sacrifice another chicken or something. Socrates takes notice of that. And this is one of the things I mean when I'm telling you this is deliberate. This is a very deliberately written piece. Why does he leave to go kill a cock? Well, because he's going to be trying to appease the gods for all the bad things that he did once, because he has so much money now from the bad stuff he did that he can get the gods to forget about it. And if that's the case, then what does that tell us about the gods? Well, it would mean that the gods aren't just. And this is one of the things that is the most concerning to Plato, because if the gods are unjust, the whole is unjust. The gods are supposed to be on the whole, right? They're in charge of the whole. We live in this hierarchical world, and humans take up some portion of it, and then above us are the gods. This is on the account, right, of the ancients. And so if the gods are disordered, if they don't value justice, what does that mean for the whole? And we'll keep coming back to that. So the next definition is the definition of Polemarchus. And Polemarchus is very spirited. He's a very good friend. He's the one who ends up dying in battle. And his definition ends up saying that you need to give benefits to friends and harm to enemies. Okay. And so what you see here is you treat your friends well and your enemies poorly. So Socrates says, look, if you have a just man that will never harm anybody, that is a truly just man. Basically, if you're just, you're not going to cause anyone harm because you know that that would be bad for that person, that it would deform them. He gives the example of people who beat dogs, right? If you beat a dog, you ruin the dog's character, and the dog is never able to really be a dog that's happy, and that doesn't attack people or that isn't terrified of people. And he says, look, the human who gets beat like that is someone who gets harmed in a similar way. And so if you are someone who does that beating, that harming, you are not just. So the just man would not even give harm to enemies, which raises the question of who is the enemy, right? So the third definition is Thrasymachus's, and Thrasymachus comes in, the text says, he comes in like a crazy person. He just kind of dispels everyone and everything. He rocks everything up. And he says, at one point they describe him as sitting there like a vulture, like looking at everything. And what does a vulture do? A vulture eats prey, right? A vulture waits for the dead and scavenges. So obviously Thrasymachus is not written to be like the person who's going to give you a good news. So like, look at how each character is connected to the justice definition they have. Thrasymachus basically is like, look, you guys are foolish. There is no such thing as justice. What justice is only is just the right of the stronger. Whoever makes the laws, whoever's in control in a regime, they get to say, well, this is what justice is. And what is justice? It's always in their interests. It's never for anybody else. It's just for what pleases them. So there's no such thing as justice, really. And if you try to be just, you'll find out that you'll be miserable. And the person who's happy is going to be the unjust person. So this, of course, Socrates, this is a big claim, and Socrates doesn't really get at it at first. You think Socrates always has something to say. He doesn't have much to say here. Though he does say something I think is important, which is he points out, what about the sheep? Like, if you're ruled, you want to take care of those that you rule. If the ruler wants to take care of those that he rules or she rules, and the shepherd wants to take care of the sheep. And Thrasymachus says, well, what does the shepherd want to take care of the sheep for? So he can eat them. Okay, so that's why he's taking care of them, not because he cares about them, but because it's in his interest to eventually eat them or sell them to be eaten. At this point, Socrates goes on a digression. This is another moment where you should be like, what's he trying to tell us by getting off topic? And the digression is this. It's a very old sort of argument. It's the argument about virtue, but this is essential for the rest of the book. To know what a virtue is, you have to know what something's function is. So what is the function of an eye? It's to see. What is the function of an ear? It's to hear. Okay. What's the function of a pruning knife? Well, it would be to be able to cut precisely, right? So a function is what a thing alone can do, or what it does better than anything else. So instead of using a pruning knife, I might be able to use other things, but it might not go as well. What I'm trying to do is prune, right? Now, to know what something's virtue is or what its excellence is, you have to know how what thing would make it do its function well. So a knife that is sharp can do its function well. Then sharpness is the excellence of the knife. What is the function of the soul, he asks. It's ruling, deliberating, and living and managing. And I want you to keep that in mind, because that is the function of the city too. Okay, that is the function of the city too. Now, Glaucon and Adeimantus are going to make a sort of case for why they're terrified by Thrasymachus. These are young men who are listening in on all of this, and they say, Socrates, we want him to be wrong. But look, we sort of think he might be right. And specifically, there are different types of good. You know, there's the good that is good for you, but it's not pleasant, like going to the dentist. There's the good that is pleasant. It has immediate benefit, but nothing beyond it, like pleasures. Like if I eat flaming hot Cheetos, there's no content there nutrition wise, but it does taste really good. And then there's the category of the good that's both, right? That is pleasant and useful. And Glaucon says that he thinks justice is the kind of good at best that is painful but has a good benefit. And Socrates says he thinks it's in that highest level of good that's both pleasurable and is beneficial. And I want you to pay attention to that because that's really important. Justice is going to be something that gives you pleasure on Socrates' account, but that'll make more sense later. So Glaucon and Adeimantus come up with these sort of fact situations. One of them is, you know, this idea that we all want to live according to our self-interest. And so the best life would be to be able to do injustice without paying a price for it. And the worst life would be to get lots of injustice directed at you and never be able to take revenge. Why we value justice is because we're too weak to do injustice. And we realize that eventually that most of us can't do injustice. And so we'll all sort of follow the law and not pursue our interests unrestrainedly, because if we do that, then we can all be safe. Another thought experiment that they offer is the ring of Gyges, which turns you invisible. And on this account, the person who is good and the person who is bad, they will both make the same decision. They will both choose something evil because they only care about the reputation or the social costs of doing something bad. If you could do it invisibly, you'd do it. You know, the man who puts on the ring of Gyges kills the king, has committed adultery with the wife before he killed him, takes over the kingdom, all because he can do this without being seen. And they're saying, we would all do this if we couldn't be seen. And he talks about the person who would be, in order for Socrates to be right, that it's in the highest category of good, you'd have to be able to have someone who's just and didn't have any reputation for justice, in fact, had the reputation for the greatest injustice, who was still able to be happy while they were being tortured for their perceived injustice. Now, they want to know then that injustice is harmful and that justice is good for its own sake. This is where Plato opens up the city-soul analogy, which is really important. The city-soul analogy goes back to what I told you. The function of the city is to rule, deliberate, and manage. The function of the soul is to rule, deliberate, and manage. So if they have the same function, they should have the same virtue. If we look at the city, it's basically a blown up portrait of the soul. And we'll be able to find what we need to find to make the arguments that we need to make if we talk about a city instead of an individual person. This is going to have a lot of political significance as we keep going. So the first step of this is the city of pigs. The city of pigs is a city where everybody has what they need. No one is self-sufficient, and we learn to exchange with each other. We live very peacefully and we live very poorly. We don't really get above the level of subsistence. And he makes it sound like people really be happy, but Glaucon's listening and he like rejects it. He goes, what about the relishes? And this means basically like, what about the salsas or the chutneys? You know, they're eating leaves and grapes and nuts, and that sounds gross because what about the cheese? What about the sauces? You know, life is more than nuts and leaves. This is Glaucon talking. And what that points to is that the human desire for more is always there. So you couldn't have something as simple as a city of pigs. It eventually expands. And as people's desires grow, we enter into the feverish city, which is the next city. People aren't content with necessities but want the unnecessary. There's more risk, but there's more reward. So they want luxuries like art and music. They want beautiful food. They want danger. They want more sex. They want to consume, consume, consume. And so in order to consume, they have to be able to have things to consume, which means that they have to go to war to become an empire because they've already used all their resources and they need someone else's resources. And this is where the feverish city begins to morph into the next part of our study, which is that when you go to war, you have a division between two classes. You have the producers, the wage earners, the farmers, and the craftsmen. And then you have the guardians who are supposed to be able to go to war to satisfy the desires and longings of the producers. They're motivated by bodily desire. And what the guardians are motivated by is spiritedness. They want to outshine each other in doing brave deeds for the city. Spiritedness turns out to be a part of all of our souls. But if you think about anyone you've known who's ever like just kind of naturally competitive or naturally ready to defend, you know, when something happens that upsets them rightly or wrongly, this can be called spiritedness. Spiritedness is neutral based on what it's directed at. And so the question becomes, how do you get this guardian class not to use its attacking powers on the citizens, which has happened over and over again in political history? How do you get it to identify the right enemy? So here you actually see the return of Polemarchus's definition. And the answer is you have to educate them to know who is the enemy. And this is the last part of our lecture for today. The education of knowing the enemy is not a rational education. It's an education of taste. So they spend all this time talking about music. They spend all this time talking about the food they'll eat. They talk about the dances they'll do, the gymnastics they'll do, the guardians will do. All of this is to shape their taste so that they will be afraid of the right things and desire the wrong things. Wait, switch out. Yeah. They will desire the right things and be afraid of the right things. And what that ultimately means is that education has this bigger meaning. Education isn't like just me and you, like doing our math homework. Education is actually the shaping of how we taste, how we reason, how we desire, which goes back to this idea of opinion, the politeia, right? That's what you have to educate. You're educating their opinion. And so he gives a famous example here, you know, of Zeus raping Hera. If Zeus rapes Hera and we think that's what the gods do, what are we going to be educated to do? We're going to think it's okay to rape people. We're going to think it's okay to attack people. We're going to think it's okay to be unjust. Okay, so then the stories that we consume start to matter too. Ultimately, the direction of all of this isn't just censorship, but it's actually the formation of judgment. So that you'll be able to get to a point to say, I desire that. I desire the just. I have a taste for it. It's not even rational. I want it. And then the rational part of it makes more sense to me, but I'm drawn to it. So here's an example. When I was young, I took a class on opera. I had to take it for credit, and I didn't want to take it because I hated opera, but it fit with my schedule and my needs. And so I took it, and I thought opera was hideous. You know, the longer I was in that class, the more I fell in love with opera. And it came from studying it and being able to understand what particular things meant, like who sang when, who sang what the pace of the music was, what an instrument signified, and also just being exposed to the poetry of the music and starting to desire it. And in the end, I loved it. And so my judgment and my desire changed together. That's how I was educated. Plato thinks that this is how justice would work, right? Especially for most people. Most of us aren't going to be out there doing philosophical arguments about justice, but most of us will begin to have a sense of justice, a taste for justice. And in fact, we all do, right? But we just want to have the right one, which has to be a product of the right education, broadly understood. And this is why, at the end, if you had the wrong education, if you're too old and you can't learn new tricks because your tastes have already been formed, you're expelled from the city. And this, should give us pause, because then it's like, what happens for our morality if we're only capable of being open to good moral choices when we're young, before we've been formed over time? Okay, so that's all for this week. But I hope that that was helpful to you, and just let me know. Thank you. Bye.